in looking at themselves in a mirror. What's ironic about that is that sometimes these mirrors, while the goal was to find maybe an imperfection, make sure you didn't have food in your teeth, make sure your hair was looking good, the mirror itself, long time ago, was not a great mirror. It would have imperfections in it. Isn't that kind of funny? You would look at it and it would have maybe a little bit of a divot in it or a wave. And I don't know if you've ever been in an antique store. Maybe you've seen some old furniture and it had like a little built-in mirror. I've seen some at times. And they're a little wavy. And you look at it and you kind of, that's not quite right. That's not what I look like. Or maybe you've been to something that was even intended to be funny, like a house of mirrors. And they will make you look short, they make you look tall, and they make you look like Humpty Dumpty, or make you look like look like Woody from Toy Story and you're real thin. That's not who you are, though. It's like a house of mirrors. It's deception. It's reflecting something back to you. It's giving you a message that may or may not be true, depending on the quality of those mirrors. Our text today, it really does speak to us like a mirror, though, because it tells us what our life, whether our life is reflecting, whether or not we have received the truth or not. That's what this parable, this opening parable, is all about. Open your Bibles to the book of Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. We're going to be starting a new discourse today. You know I've introduced this idea of a discourse to you. You may have already known about it, but there are 5 major discourses in the book of Matthew. The first one, there's 5. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount. It comprises 3 chapters. It is a long, extended teaching or preaching monologue. There's some dialogue in it, but mostly it is the just straightforward teaching of Jesus, delivering some very important truths in His ministry. The second discourse we looked at was the mission discourse. That was in chapter 10. And chapter 13 is another major discourse. And so we get to begin that today. Follow along with me as we read the first 9 verses of this discourse. Beginning at verse 1, chapter 13. The same day went Jesus out of the house and sat by the seaside. And great multitudes were gathered together unto him, so that he went into a ship and sat. And the whole multitude stood on the shore. And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places, where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. As I just mentioned, this is the beginning of one of Jesus' major discourses. Chapter 13 is called by some the chapter of parables. Some call it the parabolic discourse. That would be its technical name given to it by Bible scholars. You won't find that in the Bible. Those are just people who analyze the Word of God, analyze the book of Matthew, and have identified chapter 13 as one of his major discourses, one of his major teaching in one setting. Some of the parables are prefaced with. You'll see this in the whole chapter. Some of them are prefaced with the kingdom is like, or the kingdom is likened unto, and then He'll give a parable. There are 7 parables in this chapter. Some call these kingdom parables. We're going to begin this, and I really like this outline. 2 major sections in chapter 13. The first major section is the parables given to the crowds, and that follows the verses 1 through 35. The parables to the crowds, the parables to the masses. And then in verses 36 through 52, you'll see the second division is the parables given to the disciples. That's my favorite outline because it's simple. I'm simple, and I like to look at it very simply. As we go through, you'll see that it's not even really that cut and dry. It's not really that even concrete. It's not really that even that neat. But one good premise for this division is this. In verse 36, He goes from outside and He moves inside. Isn't that interesting? I remember there at the end of chapter 12, we were where? Inside the house. And now He moves outside and He begins to address the masses once again. A few more things I want to point out here is that although there is no denying there's a certain emphasis on the kingdom, there is not an abandonment of what He has been saying about the rejection of Himself. Keep in mind the last 2 chapters, chapters 11 and 12, have been talking about this rejection here. And then in verse 1 of chapter 13, He talks about that house that He was talking about in chapter 12. It seems that Matthew here is connecting all of chapter 13 to what he has just been saying. And so the major shift here is not necessarily in the topic of rejection of Jesus, but the major change is His method of teaching. He begins to teach in parables. So we haven't jumped tracks here. What is a parable? Well, Jesus told parables like no one else. You may not know this, but parabolic teaching is a way of teaching that the rabbis had also used. What was unique about the parables of Jesus is that no one could tell a story like Jesus. The rabbis would use illustrations. A parable is like an illustration. A parable is a figurative language. It is not a true story. Sometimes I've heard almost humorously people will try to teach a parable or preach a parable, and it's almost that we are talking about something that really exists. Jesus is not talking about a true story. He is telling you a story to teach something that is a reality. He is teaching you a theological truth by giving you an earthly illustration. Some have even tried to take parables and take them into a very neat and concrete way and saying, here is the formula to interpreting parables. If that was the case, then why did Jesus interpret the first parable and their rubric doesn't match up? There is no one way of giving you a formula to interpret it. Context means everything. And he also will say in the next section that it has something to do with God opening your eyes to the meaning of the parables. The parables came in all kinds of forms. They came in riddles. They came in allegories. They came in similitudes. They came in proverbial types. There's all kinds of types of parables. The first one here, and the main point of these 9 verses is that this parable of the sower is one example of Jesus teaching and preaching, and it includes that aspect of parables that people receive truth and are willing to listen. Notice here in verse 1 and 2, he gives us the setting, doesn't he? He says there in verse 1, the first two verses are an introduction to the whole chapter. The sermon that we're going to have today, the message, is going to really begin in the second half of verse 3. But notice the setting here before we even get started. Jesus has moved out of the house, hasn't he? The house that he was in when his family was on the outside. And they say, "Look, Lord, your family is on the outside." And he says, "Here is my family." That house where he was teaching the Pharisees and his disciples. He moves outside and he goes to the beach. Don't you like going to the beach? If you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place, isn't it? The sounds of the beach. Can you hear it? Can you hear the wind blowing? Can you hear the waves crashing? What a beautiful scene. Our family loves to go to the beach. We didn't go this year, but we love to spend our family vacations on the beach. Some people don't like the beach. Some people don't like the sand. I love the sand. I love to take my shoes off and be barefoot in the sand. And I love early mornings with that cup of coffee on the beach because no one is bothering me. I am out there and it's so serene, it's beautiful. As far as you can see just waters. The sky and the water just come together and just comes together and they meet. Beautiful scenery. Jesus is on the beach. And it says that he sat down on the beach. You may not know this, that the posture for a rabbi who was teaching would be that he would sit down. He was sitting down and he would have his disciples come around, his followers come around, and he would begin teaching, and he is on the beach, and if the rabbi was preaching, he would stand. Jesus is not really preaching here, is he? He is teaching. He is in a posture that the rabbis would do of sitting down with his disciples. Well, something happens that changes, doesn't it? Notice in verse 2, it says, "And great multitudes were gathered together unto him." So it starts out as Jesus with his small band of disciples. He is sitting down. And then great multitudes begin to gather around Jesus. They are gathering on the beach so that the whole shore begins to fill with people. And Jesus has to move. Notice what it says. It says, so that he went into a ship. He could no longer be sitting on the beach. He had to move out and get into a boat. And the boat was in the water. I have heard that the acoustics would be wonderful as he would sit in his boat and his voice would carry up on the shore and they would hear the teaching of Jesus. And it says there that he also remained sitting. Look what it says. Matthew tells you for the second time that he was sitting in a posture of teaching. And it said the whole multitude watched Jesus as he sat in the boat and taught the people. And then Matthew tells you one more thing before we see this parable. It says that he spake many things. So much for our concrete, formulaic rubric of chapter 13. Because Matthew tells us he spake on many things. Indeed, the primary emphasis of Jesus is the kingdom. That's what his primary, that's easy, isn't it? But within the realm and the sphere of teaching about the kingdom, Matthew says that he spake many things. That means that he didn't have just one topic. Some of these parables were given to the crowds. Others were given to his disciples. He spake on a variety of topics related to the kingdom. He was speaking to a multitude. Look at that in verse 2. It was a multitude that stood on the shore. There were people, get this, There were people with all sorts of different stories, didn't they? Yesterday we got to talk to a lot of different people. I love talking to people. I love when it was busy. People be passing through. You could hear the noise of people talking. And as people were talking yesterday, they all had a different story. All of these people that are gathered around Jesus as He is teaching, as He is sitting on the shore, they have a different story. Some of them are lost. Some of them might be following Him. Some of them may not know what to do yet. Some of them are expecting the Messiah to appear at any time, and they're wondering, is this the Messiah? And that's all they know. They don't know anything about being saved. All they know is that they are going to, the Pharisees are great models of righteousness. That's all they know. They have a different story. Multitudes, an array, a variety of people are listening to Jesus. And Matthew tells you in the first part of verse 3, chapter 13, is that He spake many things. Here's His method, in parables. As I've already told you, parables are similitudes. They are illustrations. It's figurative language. They are not literal. They are figurative. Notice what we have here. The parable. Here is the parable. Now if we haven't already been taken back to imagine what it was like with Jesus on the shore. Now, I love those movies where they kind of make the screen look a little blurry and you kind of go back in time, right? Jesus says, behold. You see that word there? Behold. It is a word that Matthew uses a lot in his gospel. And it literally means look. Look. Here, I think he means it a little more dramatic than he has in the past. In other words, what I'm saying to you is this. Sometimes in Matthew, it was behold, and then something in real life was happening, and he wants the reader to look at something that is really happening. Here, this look, it means imagine for a moment. Think about with me for a moment a sower. This parable is about a farmer, isn't it? It is about a sower, and we don't know much about the sower. We don't know his name. So we don't know his character. We don't know if he's nice. We don't know his intentions. We know nothing about it. And let me tell you, that's the first clue that should tell you he's not the most important aspect of the parable. Let me give you an example. In the 16th chapter of Luke, their parable is recorded there, and it says there was an unjust steward. He tells you something about the character of the person, the character of the character, right? The character of the character in the story, because it is important. It's not important. The only thing that is important is that he is a sower. And he goes forth to sow. Well, what is his goal? His goal is to take seed, put it in the ground, and there to be a crop. That's his goal. Now watch what he does here with his parable. He says, a sower went forth to sow. He is going and doing what sowers do. That's what all sowers do, right? They go forth to sow. He is going about his work. And so now we are imagining this sower, and he is doing his normal duties and routines of what a sower would do. And notice what happens as he takes you through the story. In verse 4, it says, and when he sowed, and while he was doing this, his objective was for seeds to take root. Notice what happens. Some of the seeds fell by the wayside. So I love the sower here too, is that not only do you not learn much about him, the one thing you can say is this guy was a pretty laid-back guy, right? You see that? He really wasn't concerned where the seeds went. He just goes forth to sow. He's not stressing about it. He's not complaining. He is not trying to be so particular about things. He just goes and he sows. He's not worried, is he? He throws the seed. We're not even going to get into this thing of whether or not how the ground was prepared, where it was plowed up and then it was plowed, the seed was plowed under or anything like that. It's not important. What we're looking at is the function of a sower. A sower puts seed in the ground. But some of the seed happens to fall on the road, on the path. The path is hard here. Do you remember what Jesus was facing in the previous chapters? He was facing those that were struggling, right? They were opposing Him. They were rejecting Him. They accused Him of being under the authority and control of Satan himself. It is hard not to think back and think about that hardened Pharisee, that hardened one who would reject Him, and this hard ground. The seed, some of the seeds fell on the hardened, beaten down path. They couldn't get in the soil. So they were exposed on top of the earth. And what happens to seeds when they are exposed? The birds would come and they would eat them up. What's going to happen? They're gone. The bird is going to take the seed. Nothing is going to happen. Well, notice what happens in the story here. It says, some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. Another example of this guy, he is so laid back. Do you think that he didn't know the ground that he was working on? He knew his ground. He knew that some had gone on the wayside. He wasn't concerned about it. He knew that some of these seeds were falling upon stony ground, shallow, right? Look at the rest of it here. It says where they had not much earth. And so there seems to be at certain times of year, because of the rain, it would wash this dirt over top of stony ground, the layer of bedrock, and there would be just enough soil to when the seed hit the soil that it would germinate. Something positive happened here, didn't it? In the first little piece of ground that the seed fell on, nothing happened at all. The seed didn't sprout, it didn't make it at all. But now we're given a little bit of hope in the story, aren't we? Something positive is happening for the sower, and there's a little bit of ground there, and at a certain time of year, there was probably enough moisture left in that little thin layer, just a few inches of soil, to where the seed would germinate. But what happens here? What happens? It says, and forthwith they sprung up, they germinated, they began to grow, but they had no deepness of earth. And so there's not enough soil for the little plant to thrive, is there? Notice in verse 6, when the sun was up, they were scorched because they had no root. They withered away. Over the course of the next few days, as the seasons began to change and they would get out of the springtime, it would start to get warm, and those winter rains and spring rains would stop. You know how it is, right? And you begin to have to water that garden, right? You begin to have to water that grass, or it's going to just get scorched and it's going to burn up. That little layer of soil, it just turns to dust. It can't support anything. Some of it might even blow away. It's so dry. Nothing can live there. Well, we almost had ourselves a little crop, didn't we? Well, let's see what happens. Notice in verse 7, some of the seeds fell among thorns. Uh-oh. What happened though? The thorns sprung up. So maybe there was just, it was some ground where the thorns had reseeded themselves, right? All plants, they reseed themselves and they begin to multiply. I'm all the time having to pull up little oak trees out of my landscaping, aren't you? The little pine, the pine cone had put a little seed there in the area you didn't like it, and you go out there and you pull it up in different times of year. Maybe the little thorn bushes had done the same thing. And when he expected the crop to come up for where the seed he had put out, also some thorn bushes began to grow up with it. But what happens is the thorn bushes choke it out. We almost had ourselves a crop there. Once again, it says it choked it out. They can't survive, can they? Notice here in the stony ground, in the thorn bushes, we were almost there, weren't we? We had a little bit of hope. We thought something was going to happen, but then the conditions just weren't favorable for growth. We thought we had it. As the hardened path reminds me of the hardened hearts of those who are rejecting Jesus. The thorn bushes and the thin layer of soil reminds us of the excited yet uncommitted crowds who are listening to Jesus. They hear it. They begin following Him. They begin talking about Jesus. Yet at some point, things fall apart for them. Same thing with the stony ground and the thorn bushes. A little glimmer of hope. They were starting, but they didn't finish. They just died. Choked out by thorns, dried up by drought. Is this story going to get good? Is there anything positive going to come about for this sower? I mean, he's out there throwing seed and his objective still isn't completed, is it? Well, notice here in verse 8. But other seeds fell into good ground. Okay, good ground. That's where the farmer can expect something good to happen, right? And good ground. And brought forth fruit. That's exactly what he wanted to happen. The seeds that fell into the good ground ended up with good results. It says there that there was this fruit. There was a harvest that was going to be able to be had. Some believe that he's talking literally about a story about heads of wheat. And some of these heads of wheat would have multiple heads on one stalk. And so some of them in really good soil and healthy soil, maybe it had been manured the year before, or it just was a really naturally good soil that had just the right minerals in it. It had just the right amount of moisture. It would yield 100-fold. Others on good ground, good enough to yield, would have less. And so this is a practical, realistic, rubber meets the road, real story about a farmer that this could happen, right? Some stalks would yield this a whole bunch, some stalks not as much. But the end result is the same. The sower went out to sow, and his goal was for something to spring up and for fruit to be there. Jesus ends this with verse 9. He who hath ears to hear, let him hear. This mirror, this text is like a mirror, isn't it? It talks to us. It is, as we listen to it, because that's what Jesus is saying. Don't think that Jesus didn't say verse 9 for nothing. Jesus said, verse 9, because He wants you to ponder it. He wants you to apply it to your life. He wants you to think deeply about these things. You think deeply about the parable of the sower. There was only one good result, and it was on the good ground. Everywhere else that the seed fell, nothing amounted to anything. It didn't amount to anything. It might have showed promise for a little bit, and that's as close as we got, but only out of the 4 different kinds of soil did one ever have a good result. He said, "He who hath ears, let him hear." Think about, are you responding positively to Jesus? Have you accepted Jesus, or have you rejected Him? Are you listening to His teaching? Are you listening to His words? Or are you sitting there skeptically, hoping that it will be over soon, and rejecting Him? This parable is not intended to be put at the front of the Farmer's Almanac on how to be a good farmer. Yeah, it's a story about farmers. It's a story about seeds growing in the dirt. But it's not a parable about how to be a good farmer. The point of the story is to answer this question: what conditions are needed for a bumper crop? The answer to the question is in the parable, isn't it? Is it thorny ground? No. Is it stony ground? No. Is it the wayside kind of ground? Nope. Not going to work. There's only one condition that is going to yield a bumper crop for the sower, and it's the good soil. He who hath ears, let him hear. Are you receiving the Word of God? Are you receiving Jesus, or are you rejecting Him? You know, I like the little phrase punchline, right? Because all of these stories have a little punchline to it. The punchline is at the end, isn't it? He says, listen. Listen. And the question is not about farming, but the question is a personal question that you have to ask yourself. Have I received Jesus? Has my heart been one that is able to be cultivated? Is it good ground to receive the Word of God? Or is my heart like a thorny bush? I got excited for a time, but I remain uncommitted. Is my heart like the wayside? It's hardened and it's going to refuse and reject Jesus. Or is it like the good soil that soaks it up like a sponge? And then there's fruit to be seen as evidence. As we stand and our musicians come and we prepare for a song of invitation, that is the question for you. The question for you is, have you received Him? And if you profess to have received Him, is there evidence in my life as we sing?